The Fox and the Cat by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Andrew Gaunce. It happened that the cat met the fox in a forest, and as she thought to herself, "He is clever and full of experience and much esteemed in the world," she spoke to him in a friendly way. "Good day, dear Mr. Fox. How are you? How is all with you? How are you getting on in these hard times?" The fox, full of all kinds of arrogance, looked at the cat from head to foot, and for a long time did not know whether he would give any answer or not. At last he said, "Oh, you wretched beard-cleaner, you piebald fool, you hungry mouse-hunter, what can you be thinking of? Have you the cheek to ask how I am getting on? What have you learnt? How many arts do you understand?" "I understand but one," replied the cat, modestly. "What art is that?" asked the fox. "When the hounds are following me, I can spring into a tree and save myself." "Is that all?" said the fox. "I am a master of 100 arts, and have into the bargain a sackful of cunning. You make me sorry for you. Come with me, I will teach you how people get away from the hounds." Just then came a hunter with 4 dogs. The cat sprang nimbly up a tree, and sat down at the top of it where the branches and foliage quite concealed her. "Open your sack, Mr. Fox, open your sack!" cried the cat to him, but the dogs had already seized him and were holding him fast. "Oh, Mr. Fox," cried the cat, "you with your 100 arts are left in the lurch. Had you been able to climb like me, you would not have lost your life." End of The Fox and the Cat by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm.
The Giant Crab by W.H.D. Rouse. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Giant Crab by W.H.D. Rouse. Once upon a time, there was a lake in the mountains, and in that lake lived a huge crab. I dare say you have often seen crabs boiled and put on a dish for you to eat. And perhaps at the seaside you have watched them sidling away at the bottom of a pool. Sometimes a boy or girl bathing in the sea gets a nip from a crab, and then there is squeaking and squealing. But our crab was much larger than these. He was the largest crab ever heard of. He was bigger than a dining room table, and his claws were as big as an armchair. Fancy what it must be to have a nip from such claws as those. Well, this huge crab lived all alone in the lake. Now the different animals that lived in the wild mountains used to come to that lake to drink. Deer and antelopes, foxes and wolves, lions and tigers and elephants. And whenever they came into the water to drink, the great crab was on the watch, and one of them at least never went up out of the water again. The crab used to nip it with one of his huge claws and pull it under, and then the poor beast was drowned and made a fine dinner for the big crab. This went on for a long time, and the crab grew bigger and bigger every day, fattening on the animals that came here to drink. So at last all the animals were afraid to go near that lake. This was a pity, because there was very little water in the mountains, and the creatures did not know what to do when they were thirsty. At last a great elephant made up his mind to put an end to the crab and his doings. So he and his wife agreed that they would lead a herd of elephants there to drink, and while the other elephants were drinking, they would look out for the crab. They did as they arranged. When the herd of elephants got to the lake, these two went in first and kept farthest out in the water, watching for the crab, and the others drank, and trumpeted, and washed themselves close inshore. Soon they had had enough and began to go out of the water, and then sure enough the elephant felt a tremendous nip on the leg. The crab had crawled up under the water and got him fast. He nodded to his wife, who bravely stayed by his side, and then she began, "Dear Mr. Crab," she said, "please let my husband go." The crab poked his eyes out of the water. You know, a crab's eyes grow on a kind of little stalk, and this crab was so big that his eyes looked like two thick tree trunks with a cannon ball on the top of each. Now this crab was a great flirt, or rather he used to be a great flirt, but lately he had nobody to flirt with, because he had eaten up all the creatures that came near him. And Mrs. Elephant was a beautiful elephant with a shiny brown skin and elegant flapping ears and a curly trunk and two white tusks that twinkled when she smiled. So when the big crab saw this beautiful elephant, he thought he would like to have a kiss, and he said in a wheedling tone, "Dear little elephant, will you give me a kiss?" Then Mrs. Elephant pretended to be very pleased and put her head on one side and flapped her tail, and she looked so sweet and so tempting that the crab let go the other elephant and began to crawl slowly towards her, waving his eyes about as he went. All this while Mr. Elephant had been in great pain from the nip of the crab's claw, but he had said nothing, for he was a very brave elephant. But he did not mean to let his wife come to any harm, not he. It was all part of their trick, and as soon as he felt his leg free, he trumpeted loud and long, and jumped right upon the crab's back. Crack, crack went the crab's shell, for, big as he was, an elephant was too heavy for him to carry. Crack, 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 the elephant jumped up and down on his back, and in a very short time the crab was crushed to mincemeat. What rejoicing there was among the animals when they saw a crab crushed to death! From far and near they came, and passed a vote of thanks to the elephant and his wife, and made them king and queen of all the animals in the mountains. As for the crab, there was nothing left of him but his claws, which were so hard that nothing could even crack them. So they were left in the pool, and in the autumn there came a great flood and carried the claws down into the river, and the river carried them hundreds of miles away to a great city where the king's sons found them and made out of them two immense drums, which they always beat when they go to war, and the very sound of these drums is enough to frighten the enemy away. End of The Giant Crab by W.H.D. Rouse. Read by Reny.
The Hillman and the Housewife by Juliana Horatia Ewing. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. It is well known that the good people cannot abide meanness. They like to be liberally dealt with when they beg or borrow of the human race, and on the other hand, to those who come to them in need, they are invariably generous. Now there once lived a certain housewife who had a sharp eye to her own interests in temporal matters, and gave alms of what she had no use for the good of her soul. One day a hillman knocked at her door. "Can you lend us a saucepan, good mother?" said he. "There's a wedding in the hill, and all the pots are in use." "Is he to have one?" asked the servant lass who had opened the door. "Aye, to be sure," answered the housewife. "One must be neighborly." But when the maid was taking a saucepan from the shelf, she pinched her arm and whispered sharply, "Not that, you slut! Get the old one out of the cupboard. It leaks, and the hillmen are so neat and such nimble workers that they are sure to mend it before they send it home. So one obliges the good people, and saves 6 pence in tinkering. But you'll never learn to be notable whilst your head is on your shoulders." Thus reproached, the maid fetched the saucepan, which had been laid by till the tinker's next visit, and gave it to the dwarf, who thanked her and went away. In due time the saucepan was returned, and as the housewife had foreseen, it was neatly mended and ready for use. At supper time the maid filled the pan with milk and set it on the fire for the children's supper. But in a few minutes the milk was so burnt and smoked that no one could touch it, and even the pigs refused the wash into which it was thrown. "Oh, good-for-nothing hussy!" cried the housewife as she refilled the pan herself. "You would ruin the richest with your carelessness. There's a whole quart of good milk wasted at once." "And that's 2 pence!" cried a voice which seemed to come from the chimney in a whining tone, like some nattering, discontented old body going over her grievances. The housewife had not left the saucepan for 2 minutes when the milk boiled over, and it was all burnt and smoked as before. "The pan must be dirty," muttered the good woman in great vexation, "and there are 2 full quarts of milk as good as thrown to the dog." "And that's 4 pence," added the voice in the chimney. After a thorough cleaning, the saucepan was once more filled and set on the fire, but with no better success. The milk was hopelessly spoilt, and the housewife shed tears of vexation at the waste, crying, "Never before did such a thing befall me since I kept house. 3 quarts of new milk burnt for 1 meal." "And that's 6 pence," cried the voice from the chimney. "You didn't save the tinkering after all, mother." With which the Hillman himself came tumbling down the chimney and went off laughing through the door. But thenceforward the saucepan was as good as any other. End of The Hillman and the Housewife by Juliana Horatia Ewing. Read by Colleen McMahon.
How Jack Went to Seek His Fortune by Anonymous. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Once upon a time, there was a boy named Jack, and one morning he started to go and seek his fortune. He hadn't gone far before he met a cat. "Where are you going, Jack?" said the cat. "I'm going to seek my fortune. May I go with you?" "Yes," said Jack, "the more the merrier." So on they went, jigglety-jolt, jigglety-jolt. They went a little farther, and they met a dog. "Where are you going, Jack?" said the dog. "I am going to seek my fortune." "May I go with you?" "Yes," said Jack, "the more the merrier." So on they went, jigglety-jolt, jigglety-jolt. They went a little further, and they met a goat. "Where are you going, Jack?" said the goat. "I'm going to seek my fortune. May I go with you?" "Yes," said Jack, "the more the merrier." So on they went, jigglety-jolt, jigglety-jolt. They went a little further, and they met a bull. "Where are you going, Jack?" said the bull. "I'm going to seek my fortune. May I go with you?" "Yes," said Jack, "the more the merrier." So on they went, jigglety-jolt, jigglety-jolt. They went a little further, and they met a rooster. "Where are you going, Jack?" said the rooster. "I'm going to seek my fortune. May I go with you?" "Yes," said Jack, "the more the merrier." So on they went, jigglety-jolt, jigglety-jolt. Well, they went on till it was about dark, and then they began to think of some place where they could spend the night. About this time they came in sight of a house, and Jack told them to keep still while he went up and looked through the window. And there were some robbers counting over their money. Then Jack went back and told them to wait till he gave the word, and then to make all the noise they could. So when they were all ready, Jack gave the word. And the cat mewed, and the dog barked, and the goat bleated, and the bull bellowed, and the rooster crowed, and all together they made such a dreadful noise that it frightened the robbers all away. And then they went in and took possession of the house. Jack was afraid the robbers would come back in the night, and so when it came time to go to bed, he put the cat in the rocking chair, and he put the dog under the table, and he put the goat upstairs, and he put the bull down cellar, and the rooster flew up onto the roof, and Jack went to bed. By and by the robbers saw it was all dark, and then they sent one man back to the house to look after their money. Before long he came back in a great fright and told him his story. "I went back to the house," he said, "and went in and tried to sit down in the rocking chair, and there was an old woman knitting, and she stuck her knitting needles into me." That was the cat, you know. "I went to the table to look after the money, and there was a shoemaker under the table, and he stuck his awl into me." That was the dog, you know. "I started to go down in the cellar, and there was a man down there chopping wood, and he knocked me up with his axe." That was the bull, you know. "But I shouldn't have minded all that if it hadn't have been for that little fellow. up on top of the house, who kept a-hollerin', 'Chuck 'em up to me! Chuck 'em up to me!' Of course, that was the cock-a-doodle-doo. End of How Jack Went to Seek His Fortune by Anonymous. Read by Max Hollway.
The Tale of Jemima Puddle-Duck, a farmyard tale for Ralph and Betsy by Beatrix Potter. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What a funny sight it is to see a brood of ducklings with a hen. Listen to the story of Jemima Puddle-Duck, who was annoyed because the farmer's wife would not let her hatch her own eggs. Her sister-in-law, Mrs. Rebecca Puddle-Duck, was perfectly willing to leave the hatching to someone else. "I have not the patience to sit on a nest for 28 days, and no more have you, Jemima. You would let them go cold, you know you would." "I wish to hatch my own eggs. I will hatch them all by myself," quacked Jemima Puddle-Duck. She tried to hide her eggs, but they were always found and carried off. Jemima Puddle-Duck became quite desperate. She determined to make a nest right away from the farm. She set off on a fine spring afternoon along the cart road that leads over the hill. She was wearing a shawl and a poke bonnet. When she reached the top of the hill, she saw wood in the distance. She thought that it looked a safe, quiet spot. Jemima Puddle-Duck was not much in the habit of flying. She ran a downhill a few yards, flapping her shawl, and then she jumped off into the air. She flew beautifully when she had a good start. She skimmed along over the treetops until she saw an open place in the middle of the wood where the trees and brushwood had been cleared. Jemima alighted rather heavily and began to waddle about in search of a convenient, dry nesting place. She rather fancied a tree stump amongst some tall foxgloves. But, seated upon the stump, she was startled to find an elegantly dressed gentleman reading a newspaper. He had black prick ears and sandy-colored whiskers. "Quack," said Jemima Puddle-Duck, with her head in her bonnet on one side. "Quack?" The gentleman raised his eyes above his newspaper and looked curiously at Jemima. "Madam, have you lost your way?" said he. He had a long bushy tail, which he was sitting upon, as the stump was somewhat damp. Jemima thought him mighty civil and handsome. She explained that she had not lost her way, but that she was trying to find a convenient dry nesting place. "Ah, is that so? Indeed," said the gentleman with sandy whiskers, looking curiously at Jemima. He folded up the newspaper and put it in his coat-tail pocket. Jemima complained of the superfluous hen. "Indeed, how interesting! I wish I could meet with that fowl. I could teach it to mind its own business. But as to a nest, there is no difficulty. I have a sackful of feathers in my woodshed. No, my dear madam, you will be in nobody's way. You may sit there as long as you like," said the bushy-tailed gentleman. He led the way to a very retired, dismal-looking house amongst the foxgloves. It was built of faggots and turf, and there were 2 broken pails, one on top of another, by way of a chimney. "This is my summer residence. You would not find my my winter house, so convenient," said the hospitable gentleman. There was a tumble-down shed at the back of the house, made of old soap-boxes. The gentleman opened the door and showed Jemima in. The shed was almost quite full of feathers. It was almost suffocating, but it was comfortable and very soft. Jemima Puddle-Duck was rather surprised to find such a vast quantity of feathers, but it was very comfortable, and she made a nest without any trouble at all. When she came out, the sandy-whiskered gentleman was sitting on a log reading the newspaper. At least he had it spread out, but he was looking over the top of it. He was so polite that he seemed almost sorry to let Jemima go home for the night. He promised to take great care of her nest until she came back again the next day. He said he loved eggs and ducklings, and he should be proud to see a fine nestful in his woodshed. Jemima Puddle-Duck came every afternoon. She laid 9 eggs in the nest. They were greeny white and very large. The foxy gentleman admired them immensely. He used to turn them over and count them while Jemima was not there. At last, Jemima told him that she intended to begin to sit next day. "And I will bring a big bag of corn with me, so that I never need leave my nest until the eggs are hatched. They might catch cold," said the conscientious Jemima. "Madam, I beg you not to trouble yourself with the bag. I will provide oats, but before you commence your tedious sitting, I intend to give you a treat. Let us have a dinner party all to ourselves." May I ask you to bring up some herbs from the farm garden to make a savory omelet? Sage and thyme and mint and 2 onions and some parsley. I will provide the lard for the stuff yard for the omelet, said the hospitable gentleman with sandy whiskers. Jemima Puddle-Duck was a simpleton. Not even the mention of sage and onions made her suspicious. She went round the farm garden, nibbling off snippets of the different sorts of herbs that are used for stuffing roast duck. And she waddled into the kitchen and got 2 onions out of a basket. The collie dog Kep met her coming out. "What are you doing with those onions? Where do you go every afternoon by yourself, Jemima Puddle-Duck?" Jemima was rather in awe of the collie. She told him the whole story. The collie listened with his wise head on one side. He grinned when she described the polite gentleman with sandy whiskers. He asked several questions about the wood and about the exact position of the house and shed. Then he went out and trotted down the village. He went to look for 2 foxhound puppies who were out at walk with the butcher. Jemima Puddle-Duck went up the cart road for the last time on a sunny afternoon. She was rather burdened with branches of herbs and 2 onions in a bag. She flew over the wood and alighted opposite the house of the bushy, long-tailed gentleman. He was sitting on a log. He sniffed the air and kept glancing uneasily around the wood. When Jemima alighted, he quite jumped. "Come into the house as soon as you have looked at your eggs. Give me the herbs for the omelet. Be sharp." He was rather abrupt. Jemima Puddle-Duck had never heard him speak like that. She felt surprised and uncomfortable. While she was inside, she heard pattering feet round the back of the shed. Someone with a black nose sniffed at the bottom of the door and then locked it. Jemima became much alarmed. A moment afterwards there were the most awful noises, barking, baying, growls and howls, squealing and groans, and nothing more was ever seen of that foxy, whiskered gentleman. Presently, Kep opened the door of the shed and let out Jemima Puddle-Duck. Unfortunately, the puppies rushed in and gobbled up all the eggs before he could stop them. He had a bite on his ear, and both the puppies were limping. Jemima Puddle-Duck was escorted home in tears on account of those eggs. She laid some more in June, and she was permitted to keep them herself, but only 4 of them hatched. Jemima Puddle-Duck said that it was because of her nerves, but she had always been a bad sitter. The end of The Tale of Jemima Puddle-Duck, a farmyard tale for Ralph and Betsy by Beatrix Potter.
The Princess in the Chest, edited by Andrew Lang. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Princess in the Chest. There were once a king and queen who lived in a beautiful castle, and had a large and fair and rich and happy land to rule over. From the very first they loved each other greatly, and lived very happily together, but they had no heir. They had been married for 7 years, but had neither son nor daughter, and that was a great grief to both of them. More than once it happened that when the king was in a bad temper, he let it out on the poor queen, and said that here they were now, getting old, and neither they nor the kingdom had an heir, and it was all her fault. This was hard to listen to, and she went and cried and vexed herself. Finally, the king said to her one day, "This can't be borne any longer. I go about childless, and it's your fault. I am going on a journey and shall be away for a year. If you have a child when I come back again, all will be well, and I shall love you beyond all measure, and never more say an angry word to you. But if the nest is just as empty when I come home, then I must part with you." After the king had set out on his journey, the queen went about in her loneliness, and sorrowed and vexed herself more than ever. At last her maid said to her one day, "I think that some help could be found, if your majesty would seek it." Then she told about a wise old woman in that country, who had helped many in troubles of the same kind, and could no doubt help the queen as well, if she would send for her. The queen did so, and the wise woman came, and to her she confided her sorrow, that she was childless, and the king in his kingdom had no heir. The wise woman knew help for this. "Out in the king's garden," said she, "under the great oak that stands on the left hand, just as one goes out from the castle, is a little bush, rather brown than green, with hairy leaves and long spikes. On that bush there are just at this moment 3 buds. If your majesty goes out there alone, fasting before sunrise, and takes the middle one of the 3 buds, and eats it, then in 6 months you will bring a princess into the world. As soon as she is born, she must have a nurse, whom I shall provide, and this nurse must live with the child in a secluded part of the palace. No other person must visit the child. Neither the king nor the queen must see it until it is 14 years old, for that would cause great sorrow and misfortune." The queen rewarded the old woman richly, and next morning, before the sun rose, she was down in the garden, found at once the little bush with the 3 buds, plucked the middle one, and ate it. It was sweet to taste, but afterwards was as bitter as gall. 6 months after this, she brought into the world a little girl. There was a nurse in readiness, whom the wise woman had provided, and preparations were made for her living with the child, quite alone, in a secluded wing of the castle, looking out on the pleasure park. The queen did as the wise woman had told her. She gave up the child immediately, and the nurse took it and lived with it there. When the king came home and heard that a daughter had been born to him, he was of course very pleased and happy, and wanted to see her at once. The queen had then to tell him this much of the story, that it had been foretold that it would cause great sorrow and misfortune if either he or she got a sight of the child until it had completed its 14th year. This was a long time to wait. The king longed so much to get a sight of his daughter, and the queen no less than he, but she knew that it was not like other children, for it could speak immediately after it was born, and was as wise as older folk. This the nurse had told her, for with her the queen had a talk now and again, but there was no one who had ever seen the princess. The queen had also seen what the wise woman could do, so she insisted strongly that her warning should be obeyed. The king often lost his patience and was determined to see his daughter, but the queen always put him off the idea, and so things went on until the very day before the princess completed her 14th year. The king and the queen were out in the garden then, and the king said, "Now I can't and I won't wait any longer. I must see my daughter at once. A few hours, more or less, can't make any difference." The queen begged him to have patience till the morning. When they had waited so long, they could surely wait a single day more, but the king was quite unreasonable. "No nonsense," said he. "She is just as much mine as yours, and I will see her." And with that he went straight up to her room. He burst the door open and pushed aside the nurse, who tried to stop him, and there he saw his daughter. She was the loveliest young princess, red and white like milk and blood, with clear blue eyes and golden hair, but right in the middle of her forehead there was a little tuft of brown hair. The princess went to meet her father, fell on his neck and kissed him, but with that she said, "Oh, father, father, what have you done now? Tomorrow I must die, and you must choose one of 3 things. Either the land must be smitten with the black pestilence, or you must have a long and bloody war, or you must, as soon as I am dead, lay me in a plain wooden chest, and set it in the church, and for a whole year place a sentinel beside it every night." The king was frightened indeed, and thought she was raving, but in order to please her he said, "Well, of these 3 things I shall choose the last. If you die, I shall lay you at once in a plain wooden chest, and have it set in the church, and every night I shall place a sentinel beside it. But you shall not die, even if you are ill now." He immediately summoned all the best doctors in the country, and they came with all their prescriptions and their medicine bottles, but next day the princess was stiff and cold in death. All the doctors could certify to that, and they all put their names to this and appended their seals, and then they had done all they could. The king kept his promise. The princess's body was laid the same day in a plain wooden chest, and set in the chapel of the castle, and on that night and every night after it, a sentinel was posted in the church to keep watch over the chest. The first morning when they came to let the sentinel out, there was no sentinel there. They thought he had just got frightened and run away, and next evening a new one was posted in the church. In the morning he was also gone. So it went every night. When they came in the morning to let the sentinel out, there was no one there, and it was impossible to discover which way he had gone if he had run away. And what should they run away for, every one of them, so that nothing more was ever heard or seen of them, from the hour that they were set on guard beside the princess's chest? It became now a general belief that the princess's ghost walked, and ate up all those who were to guard her chest, and very soon there was no one left who would be placed on this duty, and the king's soldiers deserted the service before their time came to be her bodyguard. The king then promised a large reward to the soldier who would volunteer for the post. This did for some time, as there were found a few reckless fellows who wished to earn this good payment, but they never got it, for in the morning they too had disappeared like the rest. So it had gone on for something like a whole year. Every night a sentinel had been placed beside the chest, either by compulsion or of his own free will, but not a single one of the sentinels was to be seen, either on the following day or any time thereafter. And so it had also gone with one on the night before a certain day, when a merry young smith came wandering to the town where the king's castle stood. It was the capital of the country, and people of every king came to it to get work. This smith, whose name was Christian, had come for that same purpose. There was no work for him in the place he belonged to, and he wanted now to seek a place in the capital. There he entered an inn, where he sat down in the public room and got something to eat. Some under-officers were sitting there, who were out to try to get someone enlisted to stand sentry. They had to go in this way day after day, and hitherto they had always succeeded in finding one or other reckless fellow. but on this day they had as yet found no one. It was too well known how all the sentinels disappeared who were set out on that post, and all that they had got hold of had refused with thanks. These sat down beside Christian and ordered drinks, and drank along with them. Now Christian was a merry fellow who liked good company. He could both drink and sing and talk and boast as well, when he got a little drop in his head. He told these under-officers that he was one of that kind of folk who are never afraid of anything. Then he was just the kind of man they liked, said they, and he might easily earn a good penny before he was a day older, for the king paid $100 to anyone who would stand as sentinel in the church all night beside his daughter's chest. Christian was not afraid of that. He wasn't afraid of anything, so they drank another bottle of wine on this, and Christian went with them up to the colonel, where he was put into uniform with musket and all the rest, and was then shut up in the church to stand as sentinel that night. It was 8 o'clock when he took up his post, and for the first hour he was quite proud of his courage. During the second hour he was well pleased with the large reward he would get, but in the third hour, when it was getting near 11, the effects of the wine passed off, and he began to get uncomfortable, for he had heard all about this post, that no one had ever escaped alive from it, so far as was known. But neither did anyone know about what had become of all the sentinels. The thought of this ran in his head so much after the wine was out of it, that he searched about everywhere for a way of escape, and finally, at 11 o'clock, he found a little postern in the steeple which was not locked, and out at this he crept, intending to run away. At the same moment as he put his foot outside the church door, he saw standing before him a little man, who said, "Good evening, Christian. Where are you going?" With that, he felt as if he were rooted to the spot and could not move. "Nowhere," said he. "Oh, yes," said the little man. "You were just about to run away, but you have taken upon you to stand sentinel in the church tonight, and there you must stay." Christian said very humbly that he dared not, and therefore wanted to get away, and begged to be let go. "No," said the little one. "You must remain at your post, but I shall give you a piece of good advice. You shall go up into the pulpit, and remain standing there. You need never mind what you see or hear. It will not be able to do you any harm if you remain in your place until you hear the lid of the chest slam down again behind the dead. Then all danger is past, and you can go about the church wherever you please." The little man then pushed him in at the door again, and locked it after him. Christian made haste to get up into the pulpit, and stood there without noticing anything until the clock struck 12. Then the lid of the princess's chest sprang up, and out of it there came something like the princess, just as you see in the picture. It shrieked and howled, "Sentry, where are you? Sentry, where are you? If you don't come, you shall get the most cruel death anyone has ever got." It went all around the church, and when it finally got sight of the smith up in the pulpit, it came rushing thither and mounted the steps. But it could not get up the whole way, and for all that it stretched and strained, it could not touch Christian, who meanwhile stood and trembled up in the pulpit. When the clock struck 1, the appearance had to go back into the chest again, and Christian heard the lid slam after it. After this there was dead silence in the church. He lay down where he was and fell asleep, and did not awake before it was bright daylight, and he heard steps outside, and the noise of the key being put into the lock. Then he came down from the pulpit and stood with his musket in front of the princess's chest. It was the colonel himself who came with the patrol, and he was not a little surprised when he found the recruit safe and sound. He wanted to have a report, but Christian would give him none, so he took him straight up to the king and announced for the first time that here was the sentinel who had stood guard in the church overnight. The king immediately got out of bed and laid the $100 for him on the table, and then wanted to question him. "Have you seen anything?" said he. "Have you seen my daughter?" "I have stood on my post," said the young smith, "and that is quite enough. I undertook nothing more." He was not sure whether he dared tell what he had seen and heard, and besides, he was also a little conceited because he had done what no other man had been able to do, or had had courage for. The king professed to be quite satisfied, and asked him whether he would engage himself to stand on guard again the following night. "No, thank you," said Christian. "I will have no more of that." "As you please," said the king. "You have behaved like a brave fellow, and now you shall have your breakfast. You must be needing something to strengthen you after that turn." The king had breakfast laid for him, and sat down at the table with him in person. He kept constantly filling his glass for him, and praising him, and drinking his health. The Christian needed no pressing, but did full justice both to the food and drink, and not least to the latter. Finally he grew bold, and said that if the king would give him $200 for it, he was his man to stand sentry next night as well. When this was arranged, Christian bade him good day, and went down among the guards, and then out into the town along with other soldiers and under-officers. He had his pocket full of money, and treated them, and drank with them, and boasted and made game of the good-for-nothings who were afraid to stand on guard, because they were frightened that the dead princess would eat them. See whether she had eaten him. So the day passed in mirth and glee, but when 8 o'clock came, Christian was again shut up in the church all alone. Before he had been there 2 hours, he got tired of it, and thought only of getting away. He found a little door behind the altar which was not locked, and at 10 o'clock he slipped out at it, and took to his heels and made from the beach. He had got halfway thither, when all at once the same little man stood in front of him and said, "Good evening, Christian, where are you going?" "I've leave to go where I please," said the smith, but at the same time he noticed that he could not move a foot. "No, you have undertaken to keep guard tonight as well," said the little man, "and you must attend to that." He then took hold of him, and however unwilling he was, Christian had to go with him right back to the same little door that he had crept out at. When they got there, the little man said to him, "Go in front of the altar now, and take in your hand the book that is lying there. There you shall stay till you hear the lid of the chest slam down over the dead. In that way you will come to no harm." With that, the little man shoved him in at the door and locked it. Christian then immediately went in front of the altar and took the book in his hand, and stood thus until the clock struck 12, and the appearance sprang out of the chest. "Sentry, where are you? Sentry, where are you?" It shrieked, and then rushed to the pulpit and right up into it. But there was no one there that night. Then it howled and shrieked again, "My father has set no sentry in! War and pest this night begin!" At the same moment it noticed the smith standing in front of the altar, and came rushing towards him. "Are you there?" it screamed. "Now I'll catch you!" But it could not come up over the step in front of the altar, and there it continued to howl and scream and threaten until the clock struck 1, when it had to go into the chest again, and Christian heard the lid slam above it. That night, however, it had not the same appearance as on the previous one. It was less ugly. When all was quiet in the church, the smith lay down before the altar and slept calmly till the following morning, when the coroner came to fetch him. He was taken up to the king again, and things went on as the day before. He got his money, but would give no explanation whether he had seen the king's daughter, and he would not take the post again, he said. But after he had got a good breakfast, and tasted well of the king's wines, he undertook to go on guard again the 3rd night. But he would not do it for less than the half of the kingdom, he said, for it was a dangerous post, and the king had to agree and promise him this. The remainder of the day went like the previous one. He played the boastful soldier and the merry smith, and he had comrades and boon companions in plenty. At 8 o'clock he had to put on his uniform again, and was shut up in the church. He had not been there for an hour before he had come to his senses and thought, "It's best to stop now while the game is going well." The 3rd night, he was sure, would be the worst. He had been drunk when he promised it, and the half of the kingdom, the king could never have been in earnest about that. So he decided to leave, without waiting so long as on the previous nights. In that way he could escape the little man who had watched him before. All the doors and posterns were locked, but he finally thought of creeping up to a window and opening that, and as the clock struck 9, he crept out there. It was fairly high in the wall, but he got to the ground with no bones broken, and started to run. He got down to the shore without meeting anyone, and there he got into a boat, and pushed off from land. He laughed immensely to himself at the thought of how cleverly he had managed, and how he had cheated the little man. Just then he heard a voice from the shore. "Good evening, Christian. Where are you going?" He gave no answer. "Tonight your legs will be too short," he thought, and pulled at the oars. But then he felt something lay hold of the boat and drag it straight into shore, for all that he sat and struggled with the oars. The man then laid hold of him and said, "You must remain at your post as you have promised." And whether he liked it or not, Christian had just to go back with him the whole way to the church. He could never get in at that window again, Christian said. It was far too high up. "You must go in there and shall go in there," said the little man, and with that he lifted him up onto the windowsill. Then he said to him, "Notice well now what you have to do. This evening you must stretch yourself out on the left-hand side of the chest. The lid opens to the right, and she comes out to the left. When she has got out of the chest and passed over you, you must get into it and lie there, and that in a hurry, without her seeing you. There you must remain lying until day dawns, and whether she threatens you or entreats you, you must not come out of it, or give her any answer. Then she has no power over you, and both you and she are freed." The smith then had to go in at the window, just as he came out, and went and laid himself all his length on the left side of the princess's chest, close up to it, and there he lay as stiff as a rock until the clock struck 12. Then the lid sprang up to the right, and the princess came out straight over him and rushed round the church, howling and shrieking, "Sentry, where are you? Sentry, where are you?" She went towards the altar and right up to it, but there was no one there. Then she screamed again, "My father has set no sentry in! War and pest will now begin!" Then she went round the whole church, both up and down, sighing and weeping. "My father has set no sentry in! War and pest will now begin!" Then she went away again, and at the same moment the clock struck 1. Then the smith heard in the church a soft music, which grew louder and louder, and soon filled the whole building. He heard also a multitude of footsteps, as if the church was being filled with people. He heard the priest go through the service in front of the altar, and there was singing more beautiful than he had ever heard before. Then he also heard the priest offer up a prayer of thanksgiving because the land had been freed from war and pestilence, and from all misfortune, and the king's daughter delivered from the evil one. Many voices joined in, and a hymn of praise was sung. And then he heard the priest again, and heard his own name and that of the princess, and thought that he was being wedded to her. The church was packed full, but he could see nothing. Then he heard again the many footsteps as old folk leaving the church, while the music sounded fainter and fainter until it altogether died away. When it was silent, the light of day began to break in through the windows. The smith sprang up out of the chest and fell on his knees and thanked God. The church was empty, but up in front of the altar lay the princess, white and red like a human being, but sobbing and crying and shaking with cold in her white shroud. The smith took his sentry coat and wrapped it round her. Then she dried her tears and took his hand and thanked him, and said that he had now freed her from all the sorcery that had been in her from her birth, and which had come over her again when her father broke the command against seeing her until she had completed her 14th year. She said further that if he who had delivered her would take her in marriage, she would be his. If not, she would go into a nunnery, and he could marry no other as long as she lived, for he was wedded to her with the service of the dead, which he had heard. She was now the most beautiful young princess that anyone could wish to see, and he was now lord of half the kingdom, which had been promised him for standing on guard the 3rd night. So they agreed that they would have each other and love each other all their days. With the first sunbeam the watch came and opened the church, and not only was the colonel there, but the king in person, come to see what had happened to the sentinel. He found them both sitting hand in hand on the step in front of the altar, and immediately knew his daughter again, and took her in his arms, thanking God and her deliverer. He made no objections to what they had arranged, and so Christian the smith held his wedding with the princess, and got half the kingdom at once, and the whole of it when the king died. As for the other sentries, with so many doors and windows open, no doubt they had run away and gone into the Prussian service. And as for what Christian said he saw, he had been drinking more wine than was good for him. End of The Princess in the Chest.
The Cellar of Dreams by Henry Beston. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Andrew Gaunce. Once upon a time, a mother called her only son into the kitchen, gave him a basket of fine, fresh eggs, and bade him carry them to his Aunt Jane, who lived a few miles down the valley. The son, a lively lad about 12 years of age, obeyed his mother with joy, and clapping his little green hat on his head, stepped forth into the road. It was a beautiful, clear morning in the spring, and the earth, released from the icy chains of winter, was rejoicing in her freedom and the return of the sun. A few birds, just back from the southland, rocked on twigs swollen with bursting buds. 1,000 rills flowing from everywhere and in every direction sparkled and sang, and the air was sweet with the odor of plowed fields. The boy, whose name was Peter, walked along whistling. Suddenly he saw a spot on the road shining as dazzlingly as if a bit of the sun itself had fallen to the earth. A bit of glass, thought Peter. But it was not a bit of glass after all, but a fine golden florin which must have dropped from somebody's purse. Peter stopped, picked up the gold piece, put it in his pocket, and walked off whistling louder than ever. In a little while he came to a place where the road wound down a little hill, and Peter saw, trudging up this hill, a very strange-looking old man. He was a very old man. His face was puckered up into 1,000 wrinkles like the skin of a shrunken apple, and he had long, snow-white hair and a white beard which reached almost to his waist. Moreover, he was strangely dressed in a robe of cherry scarlet and wore golden shoes. From a kind of belt hung 2 horns on silver chains, one an ordinary cow's horn, the other a beautiful horn carved of the whitest ivory, and decorated with little figures of men and animals. "Dreams to sell, dreams to sell," called out the old man as soon as he caught sight of Peter. "Don't you want to buy a dream, young man?" "What kind of dreams have you?" asked Peter. "Good, bad, true, false, all kinds," replied the seller of dreams. "I even have a few thrilling nightmares. Dreams to sell, dreams to sell." "How much does a dream cost?" asked Peter. "A golden florin," answered the merchant. "I'll have one, please," said Peter, and he handed over the florin he had found. The old man took a kind of wonderful sugar plum out of the ivory horn, and gave it to Peter to eat. "You will have the dream next time you sleep," said he, and trudged on. So Peter continued his journey, stopping every once in a while to look back at the strange old man who was slowly climbing the hill. At length Peter came to a little quiet grove of pines, and there he sat down on a big stone, and ate the luncheon which his mother had prepared for him. The sun was high in the heavens. It was close on to high noon. Now, as Peter was contentedly munching his bread and cheese, he heard, at first far away, then quite near at hand, the clear notes of a coachman's horn. The notes of the second call died away in a great pattering of hoofs and tinkling of little bells, and suddenly, arriving in a great swirl of yellow dust, came a magnificent coach, drawn by 12 white horses. A lady, very richly dressed and wearing many sparkling diamonds, sat within the coach. To Peter's astonishment, the lady was his Aunt Jane. The coach stopped with a great jingling of the 12 harnesses, and Aunt Jane leaned out of the window and said to Peter, "What are you doing here, child?" "I was on my way to your cottage with a basket of fine fresh eggs," answered Peter. "Well, it's fortunate I found you," said Aunt Jane, "for I have given up living in the cottage, and have now got a castle of my own. Jump in, Peter, and don't forget your basket." So Peter climbed into the coach, closed the door behind him, and was driven away. The coach went over hill and down dale. It went through strange forests from whose branches green parrots whooped and shrieked. It rolled through valleys and strange shining mountains. Peter stole a look at Aunt Jane and saw that she was wearing a crown. "Are you a queen, Aunt Jane?" he asked. "Indeed I am," replied his aunt. "You see, Peter, 2 days ago, while I was looking for my white cow who had strayed away, I came upon the magnificent castle to which we are now going. It has 4 beautiful towers and a door set with diamonds." "Whose castle is this?" I said to the lodge-keeper. "It's nobody's, marm," said he. "What?" said I. "Do you mean to say that nobody owns this fine castle?" "That's just what I mean to say, marm," answered he. "The castle belongs to anyone who wants it." So into the castle I walked, and I didn't go out, you may be sure, till I had been into every room that I could find. Then I put on these clothes and these diamonds, which I found in a cupboard, and went down and told the servants I intended to be queen. You see, Peter dear, there's nothing that a woman of determination and energy can't accomplish. The coach rolled on, and soon Peter caught sight of Aunt Jane's castle. It was rather large, and had an enormous round tower at each corner, a thing which brought to Peter's mind the picture of an elephant lying on its back. "Do you think you could eat a little more of something?" said Aunt Jane, taking off her white kid gloves. "Because if you can, I'll have a place set for you at the luncheon table." And Peter, who, like all boys, could eat a little more anywhere and at any time, readily answered yes. So Peter and Aunt Jane sat down to a wonderful little table covered with a snow-white cloth. "Draw your chair nearer, Peter dear," said Aunt Jane. "I can't," said Peter. "It's stuck to the floor." And so it was. The chair was stuck to the floor, and no amount of pushing or pulling could budge it. "That's odd," said Aunt Jane, "but never mind. I'll push the table over to the chair." But like the chair, the table refused to budge. Peter then tried to slide his plate of soup closer to him, but the plate, which the servant had placed on the cloth but an instant before, had evidently frozen to the table in some extraordinary manner and could not be moved an inch. The soup in the plate, however, was not fastened to the dish, nor were the wonderful strawberry cakes and the delicious ices with which the dinner closed. "You don't suppose this castle is enchanted, do you, Aunt Jane?" asked Peter. "Not a bit of it," replied Aunt Jane. "And even if it were," she continued recklessly, "I shouldn't mind, for there's nothing that a woman of determination and energy can't accomplish." There was a pause, and then Aunt Jane added, "I am going to have some guests to dinner this evening, so run around and amuse yourself as well as you can. There's ever so much to see in the castle, and in the garden there's a pond with swans in it." Attended by her servants, Aunt Jane majestically walked away. Peter spent the afternoon exploring the castle. He went through room after room. He scurried through the attics like a mouse, and was even lost for a while in the cellars. And everywhere he went he found everything immovable. The beds, tables, and chairs could neither be moved about nor lifted up, and even the clocks and vases were mysteriously fastened to their places on the shelves. The night came on. Coach after coach rolled up to the diamond door, which sparkled in the moonlight. When the guests had all arrived, a silver trumpet sounded, and Aunt Jane, dressed in a wonderful gown of flowering brocade edged with pearls, came solemnly down the great stairway of the castle hall. 2 little black boys, dressed in oriental costume and wearing turbans, held up her gorgeous train, and she looked very grand indeed. Peter, to his great surprise, found himself dressed in a wonderful suit of plum-colored velvet. "Welcome, my friends," said Queen Jane, who had opened a wonderful ostrich feather fan. "Are we not fortunate in having so beautiful a night for our dinner?" And the Queen, giving her arm to a splendid personage in the uniform of an officer of the King's Dragoons, led the way to the banquet hall. The wonderful party, all silks and satins and gleaming with jewels, swept like a peacock's tail behind her. Soon dinner was over, and the guests began to stray by 2s and 3s to the ballroom. Aunt Jane and the soldier led off the grand march. Then came wonderful stately minuets, quadrilles, and sweet old-fashioned waltzes. The merriment was at its height when somebody ran heavily up the great stairs leading to the ballroom, and the guests, turning round to see whence came the clatter, saw standing in the doorway a strange old man dressed in a robe of cherry scarlet and wearing golden shoes. It was the Seller of Dreams. His white hair was disheveled, his robe was awry, and there was dust on his golden shoes. "Foolish people!" screamed the old Seller of Dreams, his voice rising to a shriek. "Run for your lives! This castle is under a terrible enchantment. In a few minutes it will turn upside down. Have you not seen that everything is fastened to the floor? Run for your lives!" Immediately there was a great babel of voices, some shrieks and more confusion, and the guests ran pell-mell down the great stairs and out the castle door. To Peter's dismay, Aunt Jane was not among them. So into the castle he rushed again, calling at the top of his voice, "Aunt Jane! Aunt Jane!" He ran through the brilliantly lit and deserted ballroom. He saw himself running in the great mirrors of the gallery. "Aunt Jane!" he cried, but no Aunt Jane replied. Peter rushed up the stairs leading to the castle tower and emerged upon the balcony. He saw the black shadow of the castle thrown upon the grass far below by the full moon. He saw the great forest, so bright above and so dark and mysterious below, and the long, snow-clad range of the adamant mountains. Suddenly a voice, louder than the voice of any human being, a voice deep, ringing, and solemn as the sound of a great bell, cried, "'Tis time!" Immediately everything became as black as ink. People shrieked, and the enchanted castle rolled like a ship at sea, and leaning too far to one side began to turn upside down. Peter felt the floor of the balcony tip beneath him. He tried to catch hold of something, but could find nothing. Suddenly, with a scream, he fell. He was falling, 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 falling. When Peter came to himself, instead of its being night, it was still noonday, and he was sitting on the same stone in the same quiet roadside grove from which he had caught sight of his Aunt Jane in her wonderful coach. A blue jay screamed at him from overhead. For Aunt Jane, the coach, and the enchanted castle had been only a dream. Peter, you see, had fallen asleep under the pines, and while he slept he dreamed the dream he purchased from the seller of dreams. Very glad to still be alive, Peter rubbed his eyes, took up his basket of eggs, and went down the road whistling. End of The Seller of Dreams by Henry Beston.
The False Collar by Hans Christian Andersen. Read by Suzabelle. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. There was once a fine gentleman, all of whose movables were a bootjack and a hair comb, but he had the finest false collars in the world, and it is about one of these collars that we are now to hear a story. It was so old that it began to think of marriage, and it happened that it came to be washed in company with a garter. "Nay," said the collar, "I never did see anything so slender and so fine, so soft and so neat. May I not ask your name?" "That I shall not tell you," said the garter. "Well, where do you live?" asked the collar. But the garter was so bashful, so modest, and thought it was a strange question to answer. "You are certainly a girdle," said the collar. "That is to say, an inside girdle. I see well that you are both for use and ornament, my dear young lady." "I will thank you not to speak to me," said the garter. "I think I have not given the least occasion for it." "Yes, when one is as handsome as you," said the collar, "that is occasion enough." "Don't come so near me, I beg of you," said the garter. "You look so much like those men folks." "I am also a fine gentleman," said the collar. "I have a bootjack and a hair comb." But that was not true, for it was his master who had them, but he boasted. "Don't come so near me," said the garter. "I am not accustomed to it." "Prude!" exclaimed the collar. And then it was taken out of the washing tub. It was starched, hung over the back of a chair in the sunshine, and was then laid on the ironing blanket. Then came the warm box iron. "Dear lady," said the collar, "dear widow lady, I feel quite hot. I am quite changed. I begin to unfold myself. You will burn a hole in me. Oh, I offer you my hand." "Rag," said the box iron, and went proudly over the collar, for she fancied she was a steam engine that would go on the railroad and draw the wagons. "Rag," said the box iron. The collar was a little jagged at the edge, and so came the long scissors to cut off the jagged parts. "Oh," said the collar, "you are certainly the first opera dancer. How well you stretch your legs out. It is the most graceful performance I've ever seen. No one can imitate you." "I know it," said the scissors. "You deserve to be a baroness," said the collar. "All that I have is a fine gentleman, a bootjack, and a hair comb. If I only had the barony." "Do you seek my hand?" said the scissors, for she was angry, and without more ado she cut him, and then he was condemned. "I shall now be obliged to ask the hair comb. It is surprising how well you preserve your teeth, miss," said the collar. "Have you never thought of being betrothed?" "Yes, of course, you may be sure of that," said the hair comb. "I am betrothed to the bootjack." "Betrothed?" exclaimed the collar. There was no other to court, and so he despised it. A long time passed away. Then the collar came into the rag chest at the paper mill. There was a large company of rags, the fine by themselves and the coarse by themselves, just as it should be. They all had much to say, but the collar the most, for he was a real boaster. "I have had such an immense number of sweethearts," said the collar, "I could not be in peace. It is true. I was always a fine starched-up gentleman. I had both a bootjack and a hair comb, which I never used. You should have seen me then, and you should have seen me when I lay down. I shall never forget my first love. She was a girdle, so fine, so soft, and so charming. She threw herself into a tub of water for my sake. There was also a widow who became glowing hot, but I left her standing till she got black again. There was also the first opera dancer. She gave me that cut which I now go with. She was so ferocious. My own hair comb was in love with me. She lost all her teeth from the heartache. Yes, I have lived to see much of that sort of thing, but I am extremely sorry for the the girdle, that went into the water tub. I have much on my conscience. I want to become white paper." And it became so. All the rags were turned into white paper, but the collar came to be just this very piece of white paper we here see, and on which the story is printed, and that was because it boasted so terribly afterwards of what had never happened to it. It would be well for us to beware that we may not act in a similar manner, for we can never know if we may not, in the course of time, also come into the rag chest and be made into white paper, and then have our whole life's history printed on it, even the most secret, and be obliged to run about and tell it ourselves, just like this collar. End of The False Collar by Hans Christian Andersen, read by Suzabelle.
The Farmer and the Badger by Ye Theodora Ozaki. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Long, long ago, there lived an old farmer and his wife, who had made their home in the mountains, far from any town. Their only neighbor was a bad and malicious badger. This badger used to come out every night and run across to the farmer's field and spoil the vegetables and the rice which the farmer spent his time in carefully cultivating. The badger at last grew so ruthless in his mischievous work and did so much harm everywhere on the farm that the good-natured farmer could not stand it any longer, and determined to put a stop to it. So he lay in wait day after day and night after night with a big club, hoping to catch the badger, but all in vain. Then he laid traps for the wicked animal. The farmer's trouble and patience was rewarded, for one fine day, on going his rounds, he found the badger caught in a hole he had dug for that purpose. The farmer was delighted at having caught his enemy, and carried him home securely bound with rope. When he reached the house, the farmer said to his wife, "I have at last caught the bad badger. You must keep an eye on him while I am out at work, and not let him escape, because I want to make him into soup tonight." Saying this, he hung the badger up in the rafters of his storehouse, and went out to work his fields. The badger was in great distress, for he did not at all like the idea of being made into soup that night, and he thought and thought for a long time, trying to hit upon some plan which he might escape. It was hard to think clearly in his uncomfortable position, for he had been hung upside down. Very near him, at the entrance of the storehouse, looking out towards the green fields and the trees and the pleasant sunshine, stood the farmer's old wife, pounding barley. She looked tired and old. Her face was seamed with many wrinkles, and was as brown as leather, and every now and then she stopped to wipe the perspiration which rolled down her face. "Dear lady," said the wily badger, "you must be very weary doing such heavy work in your old age. Wouldn't you let me do that for you? My arms are very strong, and I could relieve you for a little while." "Thank you for your kindness," said the old woman, "but I cannot let you do this work for me, because I must not untie you, for you might escape if I did, and my husband would be very angry if he came home and found you gone." Now the badger is one of the most cunning animals, and he said again in a very sad, gentle voice, "You are very unkind. You must untie me, for I promise not to try to escape. If you are afraid of your husband, I will let you bind me again before his return, when I have finished pounding the barley. I am so tired and sore, tied up like this. If you would only let me down for a few minutes, I would indeed be thankful." The old woman had a good and simple nature, and could not think badly of anyone. Much less did she think that the badger was only deceiving her in order to get away. She felt sorry, too, for the animal. As she turned to look at him, he looked in such a sad plight, hanging downwards from the ceiling by his legs, which were all tied together so tightly that the rope and the knots were cutting into the skin. So in the kindness of her heart, and believing the creature's promise that he would not run away, she untied the cord and let him down. The old woman then gave him the wooden pedestal and told him to do the work for a short time while she rested. He took the pedestal, but instead of doing the work as he was told, the badger at once sprang upon the old woman and knocked her down with the heavy piece of wood. He then killed her and cut her up and made soup of her, and waited for the return of the old farmer. The old man worked hard in his field all day, and as he worked he thought of the pleasure that no more now would his labor be spoiled by the destructive badger. Towards sunset he left his work and turned to go home. He was very tired, but the thought of a nice supper of hot badger soup awaiting his return cheered him. The thought that the badger might get free and take revenge on the poor old woman never once crossed his mind. The badger meanwhile assumed the old woman's form, and as soon as he saw the old farmer approaching, came out to greet him on the veranda of the little house, saying, "So you have come back at last. I have made the badger soup and have been waiting for you a long time." The old farmer quickly took off his straw sandals and sat down before his tiny dinner tray. The innocent man never even dreamed that it was not his wife, but the badger, who was waiting upon him, and asked at once for the soup. Then the badger suddenly transformed himself back to his natural form and cried out, "You wife-eating old man! Look out for the bones in the kitchen!" Laughing loudly and derisively, he escaped out of the house and ran away to his den in the hills. The old man was left behind alone. He could hardly believe what he had seen and heard. Then, when he understood the whole truth, he was so scared and horrified that he fainted right away. After a while he came round and burst into tears. He cried loudly and bitterly. He rocked himself to and fro in his hopeless grief. It seemed too terrible to be real that his faithful old wife had been killed and cooked by the badger, while he was working quietly in the fields, knowing nothing of what was going on at home, and congratulating himself on having once for all got rid of the wicked animal who had so often spoiled his fields. And oh, the horrible thought! He had very nearly drunk the soup which the creature had made of his poor old woman. "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear," he wailed out loud. Now, not far away, there lived in the same mountain a kind, good-natured old rabbit. He heard the old man crying and sobbing, and at once set out to see what was the matter, and if there was anything he could do to help his neighbor. The old man told him all that had happened. When the rabbit heard the story, he was very angry at the wicked and deceitful badger, and told the old man to leave everything to him, and he would avenge his wife's death. The farmer was at last comforted, and wiping away his tears, thanked the rabbit for his goodness in coming to him in his distress. The rabbit, seeing that the farmer was growing calmer, went back to his home and laid his plans for the punishment of the badger. The next day the weather was fine, and the rabbit went to find the badger. He was not to be seen in the woods, or on the hillside, or in the fields anywhere. So the rabbit went to his den and found the badger hiding there. For the animal had been afraid to show himself ever since he had escaped from the farmer's house, for fear of the old man's wrath. The rabbit called out, "Why are you not out on such a beautiful day? Come out with me, and we will go and cut grass on the hills together." The badger, never doubting but that the rabbit was his friend, willingly consented to go out with him, only too glad to get away from the neighborhood of the farmer and the fear of meeting him. The rabbit led the way miles from their homes, out on the hills where the grass grew tall and thick and sweet. They both set to work to cut down as much as they could carry home, to store it up for their winter food. When they had each cut down all they wanted, they tied it in bundles and then started homewards, each carrying his bundle of grass on his back. This time the rabbit made the badger go first. When they had gone a little way, the rabbit took out a flint and steel, and striking it over the badger's back as he is stepping along in front, set the bundle of grass on fire. The badger heard the flint striking and asked, "What is that noise? Crack, crack?" "Oh, that is nothing," replied the rabbit. "I only said crack, crack because this mountain is called Crackling Mountain." The fire soon spread in the bundle of dry grass on the badger's back. The badger, hearing the crackle of burning grass, asked, "What is that?" "Now we have come to Burning Mountain," answered the rabbit. By the time the bundle was nearly burned out and all the hair had been burned off the badger's back, he now knew what had happened by the smell of the smoke and burning grass. Screaming with pain, the badger ran as fast as he could to his hole. The rabbit followed and found him lying on his bed, groaning with pain. "What an unlucky fellow you are," said the rabbit. "I can't imagine how this happened. I will bring you some medicine which will heal your back quickly." The rabbit went away, glad and smiling to think that the punishment upon the badger had already begun. He hoped that the badger would die of his burns, for he felt that nothing could be too bad for the animal, who was guilty of murdering a poor helpless old woman who had trusted him. He went home and made an ointment by mixing some sauce and red pepper together. He carried this to the badger, and before putting it on, he told him that it would cause him great pain, but that he must bear it patiently, because it was very wonderful medicine for burns and scalds and such wounds. The badger thanked him and begged him to apply it at once. But no language can describe the agony of the badger as soon as the red pepper had been pasted all over his sore back. He rolled over and howled loudly. The rabbit, looking on, felt that the farmer's wife was beginning to be avenged. The badger was in bed for about a month, but at last, in spite of the red pepper application, his burns healed and he got well. When the rabbit saw that the badger was getting well, he thought of another plan by which he could compass the creature's death. So he went one day to pay the badger a visit and to congratulate him on his recovery. During the conversation, the rabbit mentioned that he was going fishing and described how pleasant fishing was when the weather was fine and the sea was smooth. The badger listened with pleasure to the rabbit's account of the way he passed his time now, and forgot all his pains and his month's illness, and thought what fun it would be if I could go fishing too. So he asked the rabbit if he would take him the next time he went out to fish. This was just what the rabbit wanted, so he agreed. Then he went home and built 2 boats, one of wood and the other of clay. At last they were both finished, and as the rabbit stood and looked at his work, he felt that all his trouble would be well rewarded if his plan succeeded, and he could manage to kill the wicked badger now. The day came when the rabbit had arranged to take the badger fishing. He kept the wooden boat himself and gave the badger the clay boat. The badger, who knew nothing about boats, was delighted with his new boat and thought how kind it was of the rabbit to give it to him. They both got in their boats and set out. After going some distance from the shore, the rabbit proposed that they should try their boats and see which one could go the quickest. The badger fell in with the proposal, and they both set to work to row as fast as they could for some time. In the middle of the race, the badger found his boat going into pieces, for the water now began to soften the clay. He cried out in great fear to the rabbit to help him. But the rabbit answered that he was avenging the old woman's murder, and that this had been his intention all along, and that he was happy to think that the badger had at last met his deserts for all his evil crimes, and was to drown with no one to help him. Then he raised his oar and struck at the badger with all his strength till he fell with the sinking clay boat and was seen no more. Thus, at last he kept his promise to the old farmer. The rabbit now turned and rowed shorewards, and having landed and pulled his boat upon the beach, hurried back to tell the farmer everything, and how the badger, his enemy, had been killed. The farmer thanked him with tears in his eyes. He said that till now he could never sleep at night, nor be at peace in the daytime, thinking of how his wife's death was unavenged. But from this time he would be able to sleep and eat as of old. He begged the rabbit to stay with him and share his home. So from this day the rabbit went to stay with the old farmer, and they lived together as good friends to the end of their days. End of The Farmer and the Badger by Ye Theodora Ozaki. Read by Max Hollway.
The Leapfrog by Hans Christian Andersen. Read by Suzabelle. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. A flea, a grasshopper, and a leapfrog once wanted to see which could jump highest, and they invited the whole world and everybody else besides who chose to come to see the festival. 3 famous jumpers were they, as everyone would say, when they all met together in the room. "I will give my daughter to him who jumps highest," exclaimed the king, "for it is not so amusing where there is no prize to jump for." The flea was the first to step forward. He had exquisite manners and bowed to the company on all sides, for he had noble blood and was, moreover, accustomed to the society of man alone, and that makes a great difference. Then came the grasshopper. He was considerably heavier, but he was well-mannered and wore a green uniform, which he had by right of birth, he said, moreover, that he belonged to a very ancient Egyptian family, and that in the house where he then was, he was thought much of. The fact was, he had been just brought out of the fields and put in a pasteboard house, 3 stories high, all made of court cards with the colored size inwards, and doors and windows cut out of the body of the Queen of Hearts. "I sing so well," said he, "that 16 native grasshoppers who have chirped from infancy, and yet got no house built of cards to live in, grew thinner than they were before for sheer vexation when they heard me." It was thus that the flea and the grasshopper gave an account of themselves, and thought they were quite good enough to marry a princess. The leapfrog said nothing, but people gave it as their opinion that he therefore thought the more, and when the house dog snuffed at him with his nose, he confessed the leapfrog was of good family. The old counselor, who had had 3 orders given him to make him hold his tongue, asserted that the leapfrog was a prophet, for that one could see on his back if there would be a severe or mild winter, and that was what one could not see even on the back of the man who writes the almanac. "I say nothing, it is true," exclaimed the king, "but I have my own opinion notwithstanding." Now the trial was to take place. The flea jumped so high that nobody could see where he went to, so they all asserted he had not jumped at all, and that was dishonorable. The grasshopper jumped only half as high, but he leapt into the king's face, who said that it was ill-mannered. The leapfrog stood still for a long time, lost in thought. It was believed at last he would not jump at all. "I only hope he is not unwell," said the house dog, when pop! He made a jump all on one side into the lap of the princess, who was sitting on a little gold stool close by. Hereupon the king said, "There is nothing above my daughter, therefore to bound up to her is the highest jump that can be made, But for this, one must possess understanding, and the leapfrog has shown that he has understanding. He is brave and intellectual, and so he won the princess. It's all the same to me, said the flea. She may have the old leapfrog for all I care. I jumped the highest, but in this world merit seldom meets its reward. A fine exterior is what people look at nowadays. The flea then went into foreign service, where, it is said, he was killed. The grasshopper sat without on a green bank and reflected on worldly things, and he said too, yes, a fine exterior is everything. A fine exterior is what people care about. And then he began chirping his peculiar melancholy song, from which we have taken this history, and which may, very possibly, be all untrue, although it does stand here printed in black and white. End of The Leapfrog by Hans Christian Andersen, read by Suzabelle. The Naughty Boy by Hans Christian Andersen, read by Suzabelle. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. A long time ago there lived an old poet, a thoroughly kind old poet. As he was sitting one evening in his room, a dreadful storm arose without, and the rain streamed down from heaven, but the old poet sat warm and comfortable in his chimney corner, where the fire blazed and the roasting apple hissed. Those who have not a roof over their heads will be wetted to the skin, said the old poet. Ah, let me in, I am cold, I am so wet, exclaimed suddenly a child that stood crying at the door and knocking for admittance, while the rain poured down and the wind made all the windows rattle. Poor thing, said the old poet, and he went and opened the door. There stood a little boy, quite naked, and the water ran down from his long golden hair. He trembled with cold, and had he not come into the warm room, he most certainly would have perished in the frightful tempest. Poor child, said the old poet as he took the boy by the hand. Come in, and I will soon restore thee. Thou shalt have wine and roasted apples, for thou art verily a charming child. And the boy was so, really. His eyes were like two bright stars, and although the water trickled down his hair, it waved in beautiful curls. He looked exactly like a little angel, but he was so pale, and his whole body trembled with cold. He had a nice little bow in his hand, but it was quite spoiled by the rain, and the tints of his many-colored arrows ran one into the other. The old poet seated himself beside his hearth, and took the little fellow on his lap. He squeezed the water out of his dripping hair, warmed his hands between his own, and boiled for him some sweet wine. Then the boy recovered, his cheeks again grew rosy, and he jumped down from the lap where he was sitting and danced round the kind old poet. You are a merry fellow, said the old man. What's your name? My name is Cupid, answered the boy. Don't you know me? There lies my bow. It shoots well, I can assure you. Look, the weather is now clearing up, and the moon is shining clear again through the window. Why, your bow is quite spoiled, said the old poet. That were sad indeed, said the boy, and he took the bow in his hand and examined it on every side. Oh, it is dry again, and it is not hurt at all. The string is quite tight. I will try it directly. And he bent his bow, took aim, and shot an arrow at the old poet, right into his heart. You see now that my bow is not spoiled, he said, laughing, and away he ran. The naughty boy, to shoot the old poet in that way! He who had taken him into his warm room, he who had treated him so kindly, and who had given him warm wine and the very best apples. The poor poet lay on the earth and wept, for the arrow had really flown into his heart. Fie, he said, how naughty a boy Cupid is. I will tell all children about him, that they may take care and not play with him, for he will only cause them sorrow and many a heartache. And all good children to whom he related this story took great heed of this naughty Cupid, but he made fools of them still, for he is astonishingly cunning. When the university students come from the lectures, he runs beside them in a black coat and with a book under his arm. It is quite impossible for them to know him, and they walk along with him arm in arm, as if he too were a student like themselves, and then unperceived he thrusts an arrow into their bosom. When the young maidens come from being examined by the clergyman, or go to church to be confirmed, there he is again close behind them. Yes, he is forever following people. At the play he sits in the great chandelier and burns in bright flames, so that people think it is really a flame, but they soon discover it is something else. He roves about in the garden of the palace and upon the ramparts. Yes, once he even shot his father and mother right in the heart. Ask them only, and you will hear what they'll tell you. Oh, he is a naughty boy, that Cupid. You must never have anything to do with him. He is forever running after everybody. Only think, he shot an arrow once at your old grandmother. But that is a long time ago, and it is all past now. However, a thing of that sort she never forgets. Fie, naughty Cupid! But now you know him, and you know, too, how ill-behaved he is. This is the end of The Naughty Boy by Hans Christian Andersen, read by Suzabelle. The Seven Ravens by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, read by Suzabelle. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. There was once a man who had 7 sons, but never a daughter, no matter how much he wished for one. At length his wife had a child, and it was a daughter. The joy was great, but the child was sickly and small and so weak that it had to be baptized at once. The father sent one of the boys in a hurry to the spring to fetch water for the baptism. The other 6 boys ran along with him, and as each strove to be the first to fill the jug, it fell into the spring. There they stood, and did not know what to do. None of them dared to go home. When they did not come back, the father grew impatient and said, "They have forgotten all about it in a game of play, the wicked boys." Soon he grew afraid lest the child should die without being baptized, and he cried out in anger, "I wish the boys were all turned into ravens." Hardly was the word spoken before he heard a whirring of wings in the air above his head. He looked up and saw 7 coal-black ravens flying high and away. The parents could not recall the curse, and though they grieved over the loss of their 7 sons, yet they comforted themselves somewhat with their dear little daughter, who soon grew strong and every day more beautiful. For a long time she did not know that she had had brothers. Her parents were careful not to mention them before her, but one day she chanced to overhear some people talking about her and saying that the maiden is certainly beautiful, but really to blame for the misfortune of her 7 brothers. Then she was much troubled and went to her father and mother and asked if it was true that she had had brothers and what was become of them. The parents did not dare to keep the secret longer and said that her birth was only the innocent cause of what had happened to her brothers, but the maiden laid it daily to heart and thought that she must deliver her brothers. She had no peace and rest until she set out secretly and went forth into the wild world to seek them out and set them free, let it cost what it might. She took nothing with her but a little ring belonging to her parents as a keepsake, a loaf of bread against hunger, a little pitcher of water against thirst, and a little chair as a provision against weariness. And now she went continually onward, far, far to the very end of the world. Then she came to the sun, but it was too hot and terrible and devoured little children. Hastily she ran away and ran to the moon, but it was far too cold and also awful and malicious, and when it saw the child it said, I smell the flesh of men." On this she ran swiftly away and came to the stars, which were kind and good to her, and each of them sat on its own little chair. But the morning star arose and gave her the drumstick of a chicken and said, "If you have not that drumstick, you cannot open the glass mountain, and in the glass mountain are your brothers." The maiden took the drumstick, wrapped it carefully in a cloth, and went onward again until she came to the glass mountain. The door was shut, and she thought that she would take out the drumstick, but when she undid the cloth it was empty, and she had lost the good star's present. What was she to do now? She wished to rescue her brothers and had no key to the glass mountain. The good little sister took a knife, cut off one of her little fingers, put it in the door, and succeeded in opening it. When she had got inside, a little dwarf came to meet her, who said, "My child, what are you looking for?" "I am looking for my brothers, the 7 ravens," she replied. The dwarf said, "The Lord Ravens are not at home, but if you wish to wait here until they come, step in." Thereupon the little dwarf carried the ravens' dinner in on 7 little plates and in 7 little glasses. The little sister ate a morsel from each plate, and from each little glass she took a sip, but in the last little glass she dropped the ring which she had brought away with her. Suddenly she heard a whirring of wings and a rushing through the air, and then the little dwarf said, "Now the Lord Ravens are flying home." Then they came and wanted to eat and drink and looked for their little plates and glasses. Then said one after the other, "Who has eaten something from my plate? Who has drunk out of my little glass?" It was a human mouth. And when the seventh came to the bottom of the glass, the ring rolled against his mouth. Then he looked at it and saw that it was a ring belonging to his father and mother, and said, God grant that our little sister may be here, and then we shall be free. When the maiden, who was standing behind the door watching, heard that wish, she came forth, and on this all the ravens were restored to their human form again. And they embraced and kissed each other and went joyfully home. End of The Seven Ravens by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, read by Suzabelle.
The Legend of the White Gifts by Phoebe A. Curtis. Read by Tajbiha. This is a Librivox recording. All the Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Legend of the White Gifts by Phoebe A. Curtis. A great many years ago, in a land far away from us, there was a certain king who was dearly beloved by all of his people. Men admired him because he was strong and just in all of his dealings. They knew they could depend upon him. Every matter that came to his consideration was careful with in his mind, and his decisions were always wise. Women trusted him because he was pure and true, with lofty thoughts and high ambitions, and the children loved him because of his gentleness and tenderness toward them. He was never so burdened with affairs of state that he could not stop to speak a pleasant word of greeting to the tiniest child, and the very poorest of his subjects knew they could count upon his interest in them. This deep-seated love and reverence for their king made the people of this country wish very much for a far way in which to give expression to it, so that he would understand it. Many consultations were held, and one after another the plans suggested were rejected, but at last a most happy solution was found. It was rapidly circulated here and there, and it met with the most hearty approval everywhere. It was a plan for celebrating the king's birthday. Of course, that had been done in many lands before, but there were certain features about the celebration which differed materially from anything that had ever been tried. They decided that on the king's birthday the people should all bring him gifts, but they wanted in some way to let him know that these gifts were the expression of a love on the part of the giver, which was pure and true and unselfish. And in order to show that, it was decided that each gift should be a white gift. The king heard about this beautiful plan, and it touched his heart in a wonderful way. He decided that he would do his part to carry out the idea and let his loving subjects know how much he appreciated their thoughtfulness. You can just imagine the excitement there was all over the land as the king's birthday drew near. All sorts of loving sacrifices had been made, and everyone was anxious to make his gift the very best he had to offer. At last the day dawned, and eagerly the people came dressed in white and carrying their white gifts. To their surprise, they were ushered into a great big room, the largest one in the palace. They stood in silence when they first entered it, for it was beautiful beyond all expression. It was a white room. The floor was white marble, the ceiling looked like a mass of soft white fluffy clouds. The walls were hung with beautiful white silken draperies, and all the furnishing were white. In one end of the room stood a stately white throne, and seated upon it was their beloved ruler, and he was clad in shining white robes, and his attendants, all dressed in white, were grouped around him. Then came the presentation of the gifts, which what a healthy of them there was, and how different they were in value. In those days it was just as it is now. There were many people who had great wealth, and they brought gifts which were generous in proportion to their wealth. One brought a handful of pearls, another a number of carved ivories. There were beautiful laces and silks and embroideries, all in pure white, and even splendid white chargers were brought to His Majesty. But many of them were poor, some of them very poor, and their gifts were quite different from those I have been telling about. Some of the women brought handfuls of white rice, some of the boys brought their favorite white pigeons, and one dear little girl smilingly gave him a pure white rose. It was wonderful to watch the king as each one came and kneeled before him as he presented the gift. He never seemed to notice whether the gift was great or small. He regarded not one gift above another, so long as all were white. Never had the king been so happy as he was that day, and never had such real joy filled the hearts of the people. They decided to use the same plan every year, and so it came to pass that year after year on the king's birthday the people came from here and there and everywhere, and brought their white gifts, the gifts that showed that their love was pure, strong, true, and without stain. And year after year after year, King sat in his white robes on the white throne in the great white room, and it was always the same. He regarded not one gift above another, so long as all were white. The end of the Legends of White Gifts, read by Tajbiha.
The Little Match Girl by Hans Christian Andersen, read by Hiranmayi. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. It was dreadfully cold. It was snowing fast and was almost dark as evening came on. The last evening of the year. In the cold and the darkness, there went along the street a poor little girl, bareheaded and with naked feet. When she left home, she had slippers on, it is true, but they were much too large for her feet, slippers that her mother had used till then, and the poor little girl lost them in running across the street when two carriages were passing terribly fast. When she looked for them, one was not to be found, and a boy seized the other and ran away with it, saying he would use it for a cradle some day when he had children of his own. So on the little girl went with her bare feet, that were red and blue with cold. In an old apron that she wore were bundles of matches, and she carried a bundle also in her hand. No one had bought so much as a bunch all the long day, and no one had given her even a penny. Poor little girl, shivering with cold and hunger, she crept along, a perfect picture of misery. The snowflakes fell on her long flaxen hair, which hung in pretty curls about her throat. But she thought not of her beauty, nor of the cold. Lights gleamed in every window, and there came to her the savory smell of roast goose, for it was New Year's Eve, and it was this of which she thought. In a corner formed by two houses, one of which projected beyond the other, she sat cowering down. She had drawn under her little feet, But still she grew colder and colder. Yet she dared not go home, for she had sold no matches and could not bring a penny of money. Her father would certainly beat her, and besides, it was cold enough at home, for they had only the house roof above them, and though the largest holes had been stopped with straw and rags, there were left many through which the cold wind could whistle. And now her little hands were nearly frozen with cold. Alas, a single match might do her good if she might only draw it from the bundle, rub it against the wall, and warm her fingers by it. So at last she drew one out. Whoosh! How it blazed and burned! It gave out a warm, bright flame like a little candle as she held her hand over it. A wonderful little light it was. It really seemed to the little girl as if she sat before a great iron stove with polished brass feet and brass shovel and tongs. So blessedly it burned that the little maiden stretched out her feet to warm them also. How comfortable she was! But lo, the flame went out, the stove vanished, and nothing remained but the little burned match in her hand. She rubbed another match against the wall. It burned brightly, and where the light fell upon the wall, it became transparent like a veil, so that she could see through it into the room. A snow-white cloth was spread upon the table, on which was a beautiful china dinner service, while a roast goose stuffed with apples and prunes steamed famously and sent forth a most savory smell. And what was more delightful still and wonderful, the goose jumped out from the dish with a knife and fork still in its breast and waddled along the floor straight to the little girl. But the match went out then, and nothing was left to her but the thick, damp wall. She lighted another match, and now she was under a most beautiful Christmas tree, larger and far more prettily trimmed than the one she had seen through the glass doors at the rich merchants'. Hundreds of wax tapers were burning on the green branches, and gay figures, such as she had seen in the shop windows, looked down upon her. The child stretched out her hands to them. Then the match went out. Still the lights of Christmas tree rose higher and higher. She saw them now as stars in heaven, and one of them fell, forming a long trail of fire. "Now someone is dying," murmured the child softly. For her grandmother, the only person who had loved her and who was now dead, had told her that whenever a star falls, a soul mounts up to God. She struck yet another match against the wall, and again it was light, and in the brightness there appeared before her the dear old grandmother, bright and radiant, yet sweet and mild, and happy as she had never looked on earth. "Oh, grandmother," cried the child, "take me with you. I know you will go away when the match burns out. You too will vanish, like the warm stove, the splendid New Year's feast, the beautiful Christmas tree." And lest her grandmother should disappear, she rubbed the whole bundle of matches against the wall. And the matches burned with such brilliant light that it became brighter than noonday. Her grandmother had never looked so grand and beautiful. She took the little girl in her arms, and both flew together, joyously and gloriously, mounting higher and higher, far above the earth, and for them there was neither hunger nor cold nor care. They were with God. But in the corner, at the dawn of day, sat the poor girl, leaning against the wall with red cheeks and smiling mouth, frozen to death, on the last evening of the old year. Stiff and cold she sat, with the matches, one bundle of which was burnt. She wanted to warm herself, poor little thing, people said. No one imagined what sweet visions she had had, or how gloriously she had gone with her grandmother to enter upon the joys of a new year. End of The Little Match Girl by Hans Christian Andersen, read by Hiranmayi. The Red Shoes by Hans Christian Andersen, read by Hiranmayi. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. There was once a little girl who was very pretty and delicate, but in summer she was forced to run about with her bare feet. She was so poor, and in winter wear very large wooden shoes, which made her little insteps quite red, and that looked so dangerous. In the middle of the village lived old Dame Shoemaker. She sat and sewed together, as well as she could, a little pair of shoes out of old red strips of cloth. They were very clumsy, but it was a kind thought. They were meant for the little girl. The little girl was called Karen. On the very day her mother was buried, Karen received the red shoes and wore them for the first time. They were certainly not intended for mourning, but she had no other, and with stockingless feet she followed the poor straw coffin in them. Suddenly a large old carriage drove up, and a large old lady sat in it. She looked at the little girl, felt compassion for her, and then said to the clergyman, "Here, give me the little girl. I'll adopt her." And Karen believed all this happened on account of those red shoes. But the old lady thought they were horrible, and they were burnt. But Karen herself was cleanly and nicely dressed. She must learn to read and sew, and people said she was a nicely thing. But the looking glass said, "Thou art more than nice, thou art beautiful." Now the queen once travelled through the land, and she had her little daughter with her. And this little daughter was a princess, and people streamed to the castle. And Karen was there also, and the little princess stood in her fine white dress in the window and let herself be stared at. She had neither a train nor a golden crown, but splendid red morocco shoes. They were certainly far handsomer than those Dame Shoemaker had made for little Karen. Nothing in the world can be compared with red shoes. Now Karen was old enough to be confirmed. She had new clothes and was to have new shoes also. The rich shoemaker in the city took the measure of her little foot. This took place at his house, in his room, where stood large glass cases filled with elegant shoes and brilliant boots. All this looked charming, but the old lady could not see well, so had no pleasure in them. In the midst of those shoes stood a pair of red shoes, just like those the princess had worn. How beautiful they were! The shoemaker said also they had been made for the child of a count, but had not fitted. "That must be a patent leather," said the old lady. "They shine so." "Yes, they shine," said Karen, "and they fitted and were bought. But the old lady knew nothing about their being red, else She would never have allowed Karen to have gone in red shoes to be confirmed. Yet, such was the case. Everybody looked at her feet, and when she stepped through the chancel door on the church pavement, it seemed to her as if the old figures on the tombs, those portraits of old preachers and preachers' wives, with stiff ruffs and long black dresses, fixed their eyes on her red shoes. And she thought only of them as the clergyman laid his hand upon her head and spoke of the holy baptism, of the covenant with God, and how she would be now a matured Christian. And the organ pealed so solemnly. The sweet children's voices sang, and the old music director sang, but Karen only thought of her red shoes. In the afternoon, the old lady heard from everyone that the shoes had been red, and she said that it was very wrong of Karen, that it was not at all becoming, and that in future Karen should only go in black shoes to church, even when she should be older. The next Saturday there was the sacrament, and Karen looked at the black shoes, looked at the red ones, looked at them again, and put on the red shoes. The sun shone gloriously. Karen and the old lady walked along the path through the corn. It was rather dusty there. At the church door stood an old soldier with a crutch, and with a wonderfully long beard, which was more red than white, and he bowed to the ground and asked the old lady whether he might dust her shoes. And Karen stretched out her little foot. "Say, what beautiful dancing shoes," said the soldier. "Sit firm when you dance," and put his hand out towards the soles. And the old lady gave the old soldier alms and went into the church with Karen. And all the people in the church looked at Karen's shoes and all the pictures, and as Karen knelt before the altar and raised the cup to her lips, she only thought of the red shoes. And they seemed to swim in it, and she forgot to sing her psalm, and she forgot to pray, "Our Father in heaven." Now all the people went out of church, and the old lady got into her carriage. Karen raised her foot to get in after her, when the old soldier said, "Look, what beautiful dancing shoes." And Karen could not help dancing a step or two, and when she began, her feet continued to dance. It was just as though the shoes had power over them. She danced around the church corner. She could not leave off. The coachman was obliged to run after and catch hold of her, and he lifted her in the carriage. But her feet continued to dance so that she trod on the old lady dreadfully. At length she took the shoes off, and then her legs had peace. The shoes were placed in a closet at home, but Karen could not avoid looking at them. Now the old lady was sick, and it was said she could not recover. She must be nursed and waited upon, and there was no one whose duty it was so much as Karen's. But there was a great ball in the city, to which Karen was invited. She looked at the old lady, who could not recover. She looked at the red shoes, and she thought there could be no sin in it. She put on the red shoes. She might do that also, she thought. But then she went to the ball and began to dance. When she wanted to dance to the right, the shoes would dance to the left, and when she wanted to dance up the room, the shoes danced back again, down the steps, into the street, and out of the city gate. She danced, and was forced to dance straight out into the gloomy wood. Then it was suddenly light up among the trees, and she fancied it must be the moon, for there was a face, but it was the old soldier with the red beard. He sat there, nodded his head, and said, "Look, what beautiful dancing shoes!" Then she was terrified and wanted to fling off the red shoes, but they clung fast, and she pulled down her stockings, but the shoes seemed to have grown to her feet. As she danced, and must dance, over fields and meadows, in rain and sunshine, by night and day, but at night it was the most fearful. She danced over the churchyard, but the dead did not dance. They had something better to do than dance. She wished to seat herself on a poor man's grave, where the bitter tansy grew, but for her there was neither peace nor rest, and when she danced towards the open church door, she saw an angel standing there. He wore long white garments. He had wings which reached from his shoulders to the earth. His countenance was severe and grave, and in his hand he held a sword, broad and glittering. "Dance shalt thou," said he. "Dance in thy red shoes till thou art pale and cold, till thy skin shrivels up, and thou art a skeleton. Dance shalt thou from door to door, and where proud, vain children dwell. Thou shalt knock, that they may hear thee and tremble. Dance shalt thou." "Mercy!" cried Karen, but she did not hear the angel's reply, for the shoes carried her through the gate into the fields, across the roads and bridges, and she must keep ever dancing. One morning she danced past a door which she well knew. Within sounded a psalm. A coffin decked with flowers was borne forth. Then she knew that the old lady was dead, and felt that she was abandoned by all, and condemned by the angel of God. She danced, and was forced to dance, through the gloomy night. The shoes carried her over stack and stone. She was torn till she bled. She danced over the heath till she came to a little house. Here she knew dwelt the executioner, and she tapped with her fingers at the window and said, come out, I cannot come in, for I am forced to dance." And the executioner said, "Thou dost not know who I am, I fancy. I strike bad people's heads off, and I hear that my axe rings." "Don't strike my head off," said Karen. "Then I can't repent of my sins. But strike off my feet in the red shoes." And then she confessed her entire sin, and the executioner struck off her feet with red shoes. But the shoes danced away with the little feet across the field into the deep wood. And he carved out little wooden feet for her, and crutches, taught her the psalm criminals always sing, and she kissed the hand which had wielded the axe, and went over the heath. "Now I have suffered enough for the red shoes," said she. "Now I will go into the church that people may see me." And she hastened toward the church door. But when she was near it, the red shoes danced before her, and she was terrified and turned around. The whole week she was unhappy, and wept many bitter tears. But when Saturday returned, she said, "Well, now I have suffered and struggled enough. I really believe I am as good as many a one who sits in the church and holds her head so high." And away she went boldly. But she had not got farther than the churchyard gate before she saw the red shoes dancing before her, and she was frightened and turned back and repented of her sin from her heart. And she went to the parsonage and begged that they would take her into service. She would be very industrious, she said, and would do everything she could. She did not care about the wages, only she wished to have a home and be with good people. And the clergyman's wife was sorry for her and took her into service, and she was industrious and thoughtful. She sat still and listened when the clergyman read the Bible in the evenings. All the children thought a great deal of her. But when they spoke of dress and grandeur and beauty, she shook her head. The following Sunday, when the family was going to church, they asked her whether she would not go with them. But she glanced sorrowfully, with tears in her eyes, at her crutches. The family went to hear the word of God, but she went alone into her little chamber. There was only one room for a bed and chair to stand in it, and whilst she read with pious mind, the wind bore the strains of the organ towards her, and she raised her tearful countenance and said, "O God, help me." And the sun shone so clearly, and straight before her stood the angel of God in white garments, the same she had seen that night at the church door. But he no longer carried the sharp sword, but in its stead a splendid green spray, full of roses, and he touched the ceiling with the spray, and ceiling rose so high, and where he had touched it there gleamed a golden star. And he touched the walls, and they widened out. And she saw the organ which was playing. She saw the old pictures of the preachers and preachers' wives. The congregation sat in cushioned seats and sang out of their prayer books, for the church itself had come to the poor girl in her narrow chamber, or else she had come into the church. She sat in the pew with the clergyman's family. When they had ended the psalm and looked up, they nodded and said, "It is right that thou art come." "It was through mercy," she said. And the organ pealed, and the children's voices in the choir sounded so sweet and soft. The clear sunshine streamed so warmly through the window into the pew where Karen sat. Her heart was so full of sunshine, peace, and joy that it broke. Her soul flew on the sunshine to God, and there no one asked after the red shoes. End of The Red Shoes by Hans Christian Andersen, read by Hiranmayi.